My gay friend's sister is a famous social justice activist, but she tried to steal his inheritance because his partner is Asian, so I exposed her racism and homophobia to all 400 of her Facebook followers and destroyed her reputation in the progressive community. She built her career. And I'm Dave, 54 years old, and I've been friends with Mark since high school. We're both gay men who grew up in a time when coming out meant losing everything. Mark is 61 now, and he's the closest thing to family I have. We met during a particularly rough period in both our lives and just clicked. Over the decades, we've been through everything together. When I got fired from my first real job for being gay, Mark let me crash on his couch for 6 months. When he came down with pneumonia and spent 2 weeks in the hospital, I took time off work to sit with him every single day. That's just how we are. Mark has 2 older sisters. Simone is 68, and Claudia is 66. I've known them almost as long as I've known Mark. Simone spent most of her adult life working for various non-profit organizations. She started in local community organizing and eventually became well-known in progressive circles. She speaks at conferences, has written articles for major publications, and maintains an active presence online where she advocates for social justice causes. Her public image is all about inclusivity, acceptance, and fighting discrimination. People who follow her work see her as a champion of marginalized communities. Mark's situation has been difficult for years. He has a degenerative condition that affects his mobility and requires ongoing medical treatment. He spends several hours every day managing his health, and it's only getting worse. The doctors have been clear that his timeline is limited, maybe a handful of years if he's fortunate. Despite all this, he works from home doing customer service for an online retailer because he needs the income. The pay is terrible, barely above minimum wage, but it's work he can do from bed on his bad days. His partner, James, is 55 and originally from the Philippines. They've been together for 18 years. James used to work full-time as a dental assistant, but 3 years ago, he cut his hours down to 25 per week so he could help Mark with daily tasks, getting dressed, preparing meals, managing medications, attending appointments. Mark can't do most of this alone anymore. The reduction in James's income put them in a tight spot financially, but there wasn't another option. They live in San Francisco, which means their rent for a tiny 1-bedroom apartment eats up most of their combined income. The place is old, the heating barely works, and there's persistent mold in the bathroom that the landlord refuses to fix properly. They've looked into moving somewhere cheaper, but Mark's medical team is specific about him staying within a certain distance from the hospital. His condition requires specialized care that isn't available in most places, so they're stuck paying San Francisco rent on an income that would be tight anywhere else. Mark's parents died within the last 18 months. His father went first, a sudden heart attack. His mother followed 7 months later. She'd been declining for a while, but losing her husband accelerated everything. They left behind their house in a small town in Oregon, some savings, and a few other assets. The total estate was worth around $450,000 after everything was sold and settled. Split 3 ways between the siblings, that came to $150,000 each. For Mark, this money represented something specific, not a windfall, not a luxury vacation, or a new car. It was enough, combined with what he'd managed to save for retirement over the years, to buy a small condo in a suburb outside the city, something with 2 bedrooms, 1 floor, accessible features, a place where he and James could live out however many years Mark has left without worrying about a landlord raising the rent or selling the building, a place where James wouldn't be left homeless after Mark dies. That's all Mark wanted from this inheritance, basic security. About 3 weeks ago, Simone and Claudia came to visit Mark and James at their apartment. Mark had been expecting this. The estate was finalized, and he assumed his sisters were coming to discuss the distribution timeline, maybe sort out some final paperwork. He ordered lunch from a local deli, tried to make the cramped apartment as presentable as possible, and waited for them to arrive. They sat in the small living room, made awkward small talk for about 20 minutes, and then Simone started talking about the inheritance. She said that she and Claudia had been discussing it extensively. They'd come to a decision about how the money should be distributed. Mark told me later that he didn't understand at first what she meant. There was a will. The division was clear. What was there to decide? Simone explained that the money was family money, not just their parents' money. It needed to stay in the family, to be passed down to the next generation. Claudia nodded along, adding that this was what their parents would have wanted if they'd really thought it through. The money should go to Simone and her children. Simone has 3 kids, all adults now in their 30s and 40s. Claudia never had children, so she was willing to accept a smaller share or nothing at all if necessary. But Mark, they said, didn't have children either. His portion of the inheritance couldn't be passed down, so it made more sense for it to go to Simone's children instead. Mark sat there trying to process what he was hearing. He pointed out that this wasn't their decision to make. Their parents' will was explicit, 1/3 to each sibling. He also mentioned that James was his family. They'd been together nearly 2 decades. The money would support both of them, and if anything happened to Mark, James would inherit whatever was left. That was his right as Mark's partner. This is when Claudia spoke up. She said that James didn't count as family because he's Asian. She actually said that once Mark died, James would probably just take whatever money was left and go back to the Philippines to support his relatives there. The money would leave the family entirely. Simone agreed, emphasizing again that this was their family money and it needed to stay with blood relatives. Mark told them both that what they were saying was racist and homophobic. He pointed out that his relationship with James was legally recognized, that they had all the same rights as any married couple. Claudia got defensive, raising her voice. She said Mark was being unreasonable and disrespectful. Simone added that they were trying to do what was best for everyone, and Mark was making it difficult by being stubborn. Mark's response was straightforward. He told them that he would get a lawyer if he received anything less than his full $150,000. He said it clearly and without raising his voice. The visit ended shortly after that. Claudia and Simone left without saying goodbye to James, who'd been in the bedroom during most of this conversation but came out toward the end. When Mark told me about this, I'd just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital where I work as a nurse. We met for coffee, which Mark rarely does anymore because getting out of the apartment takes so much effort. I knew something serious had happened before he even started talking. He went through the whole conversation, pausing occasionally when he had to catch his breath or when the words got stuck. By the time he finished, I'd finished 3 cups of coffee and my hands were shaking. I've known these women for decades. I've been to their homes. I've met their kids, attended their family gatherings. Simone especially has always presented herself as an ally. She's spoken at Pride events, written articles defending LGBTQ rights, publicly criticized politicians who pushed discriminatory policies, and now she was trying to steal her dying brother's inheritance because he's gay and his partner is Asian. Mark said he was done with both of them. He wasn't going to call, wasn't going to engage, wasn't going to try to reason with them further. He'd get a lawyer and handle it through legal channels. I asked if he'd heard anything from them since the visit. He said no, which didn't surprise me. They probably thought they'd made their case and now just needed to wait for him to come around. What bothered me most wasn't even what they were trying to do to Mark, though that was terrible enough. It was that Simone would just go back to her life, to her public persona, to her speaking engagements and her social media following, with nobody knowing what she'd done. She'd continue being celebrated as this progressive champion while privately trying to rob her disabled brother of the one chance he had at stability. I started thinking about her online presence. Simone has a significant following on social media, particularly on Facebook, where she's most active. Around 400 people follow her public posts. Many of them are fellow activists, people she's worked with over the years, members of various organizations. I went through her friend list, recognizing names of local politicians, nonprofit directors, journalists who cover social justice issues. I wrote out a message, not long, maybe 300 words. I laid out exactly what Simone had said and done. The claim that Mark's inheritance should go to her children because he was gay and had no kids. The statement that James didn't count as family because he's Asian. The assumption that James would take the money back to the Philippines. I didn't exaggerate or add anything. I just stated what happened. I sat with that message for 2 days. I kept thinking about sending it to all 400 of Simone's Facebook friends. Just a simple message explaining who her brother was, what his situation was, and what she'd tried to do to him. It would destroy her reputation. Everything she'd built over decades would collapse. People would question every position she'd ever taken, every article she'd written, every speech she'd given. But I didn't send it. Not yet. Part of me wondered if I was overreacting, if this was going too far. Mark's approach was to handle it legally and then cut contact. That was clean, straightforward. My approach would be scorched earth, and I wasn't sure if that was justified or if I was just letting my anger make decisions. I'm posting this here because I genuinely don't know if I should send this message. Would it be too much? Mark is handling this through proper legal channels, and that's probably enough. But the idea that Simone gets to keep her reputation intact while doing something this awful makes my blood boil. On the other hand, maybe revenge isn't mine to take. Maybe the right thing is to let it play out legally and leave it at that. So I'm asking, would sending this message to all of Simone's Facebook friends be overkill? Or is it exactly what someone like her deserves? Update 1. Several things have happened since I first posted. I want to lay them out chronologically because the sequence matters. About a week after my original post, Mark got a phone call from Claudia. This surprised both of us because we'd assumed Claudia and Simone were a unified front. The call lasted nearly an hour. Claudia told Mark that she needed to apologize and explain what had actually happened from her perspective. According to Claudia, Simone had approached her about a month before their parents' estate was finalized. Simone's youngest son had recently lost his job in tech, part of a larger layoff at his company. Her daughter was going through a divorce and facing significant legal fees. Her oldest son's business had taken losses during the pandemic and hadn't fully recovered. Simone was worried about all 3 of them and had been helping financially, but her own savings were depleted. Simone suggested to Claudia that maybe they could talk to Mark about redistributing the inheritance. She framed it as Mark being understanding since he didn't have children to support. Claudia said she initially refused, but Simone kept bringing it up. She painted a picture of her children struggling while Mark and James were just two people with relatively simple needs. She suggested they could at least propose it, and if Mark said no, they'd drop it. Claudia told Mark that she went along with the visit because she thought it would just be a conversation. She expected Mark might actually agree once he understood how much Simone's children needed help. She admitted this was naive, but she wanted to believe the family could work something out cooperatively. What Claudia said she didn't expect was Simone's comments about James. She told Mark that when Simone started talking about James being Asian and implying he'd take money back to the Philippines, Claudia was stunned. She sat there silent because she doesn't handle confrontation well, especially not with Simone, who has always been the dominant personality among the siblings. Claudia said she felt sick during the rest of the visit, but couldn't find words to object in the moment. After they left Mark's apartment, Claudia said she waited until they were alone and then confronted Simone. She told her sister that what she'd said about James was racist and completely out of line. She said Mark deserved his full share of the inheritance and that they had no right to try to take it. Simone's response was to double down. She said Claudia was being too sensitive and that she was just stating facts. Asian families take care of their own, Simone said, so of course James would send money back home. Claudia called Mark because she wanted him to know that she didn't support Simone's position. She said she'd give up her own share entirely if it meant Mark got what he was owed. Mark thanked her for the call, but told her he didn't need her to give up anything. He just wanted his 1/3, which was legally his. Claudia agreed and said she'd make sure their brother got every cent. This call shifted things. Mark had been preparing for a 2-against-1 situation. Now it was just Simone. That should have made things easier, but what happened next made everything more complicated. About 10 days after Claudia's call, Mark received a formal letter from a law office representing Simone. She was filing a legal claim against the estate, specifically contesting Mark's share. The basis of her claim was that she had served as primary caregiver for their parents during the final 4 years of their lives and had not been adequately compensated. She was seeking reimbursement for her time and expenses, which she calculated as coming to approximately $120,000. This amount would come out of Mark's share. I need to explain why this claim was complete nonsense. Simone did help care for their parents during their final years. They lived in the same town where she'd settled, about 40 minutes from her house, but she wasn't some unpaid martyr sacrificing everything. First, she received a government caregiver allowance the entire time, which amounted to about $1,500 per month. Second, she had access to their parents' bank accounts and monthly pension payment. Their father's pension was $2,800 monthly, and their mother had a smaller pension of about $1,200. Simone paid household bills from these accounts, but also regularly withdrew cash for herself. Claudia told Mark that she'd reviewed the accounts after their mother died and found that Simone had withdrawn roughly $35,000 over those 4 years beyond what was needed for household expenses. When Claudia asked about it, Simone claimed it was reimbursement for groceries and other costs she'd covered personally, but she never provided receipts. Additionally, Simone's oldest son, who's fairly wealthy from a successful startup exit, sent his mother money regularly to help with whatever she needed. Claudia herself had sent Simone $5,000 twice to help cover what Simone claimed were expensive medical supplies their insurance didn't cover. Other family members, including cousins, also helped with caregiving duties, coming by to sit with their parents, taking them to appointments, helping with household maintenance. Simone also took several vacations during those 4 years. Long weekends in wine country, a week in Hawaii, 10 days in Europe with her daughter. She wasn't chained to her parents' house 24/7. She had support, she had financial resources, and she was never some struggling caregiver barely getting by. Now compare that to Mark's situation during the same period. 4 years ago, Mark was undergoing dialysis treatment, which took 8 hours per day, 5 days a week. He was on a transplant waiting list and continuing to work his customer service job from a laptop at the dialysis center because he couldn't afford to stop working. 2 years ago, he received a kidney transplant. The surgery went well, but recovery took 3 months of complete rest, during which he worked from his bed because his job didn't offer paid medical leave. Mark's medical team has strict requirements about his location. He must stay within a 30-minute ambulance radius of his specific hospital, which has the specialized equipment and expertise his condition requires. His parents lived in a small town over 500 miles away in a different state. There was no way for Mark to physically be there to help with their care, even if his health had allowed it. Simone knew all of this. Everyone in the family knew this. But now she was claiming that Mark had failed to provide support and therefore didn't deserve his full inheritance. It was a legal maneuver designed to either reduce what he received or force him to settle for less just to avoid a court battle. Mark called me the same day he received the legal letter. I told him to forward everything to me immediately. I work at a hospital network with an in-house legal department that handles various matters, and I knew one of the attorneys specialized in estate disputes. More specifically, she specialized in cases where LGBTQ individuals were being cheated out of inheritances by homophobic family members. I'd heard her give a presentation at a workplace diversity event about a year earlier. I contacted her, explained the situation, and asked if she could recommend anyone. She said she'd take the case herself. Mark met with her 3 days later, bringing all the documentation he had. Bank statements showing Simone's withdrawals, medical records demonstrating his physical condition and treatment requirements during the relevant years, written statements from Claudia and other family members about the support Simone had received. The attorney was confident. She told Mark that Simone's claim was weak legally, but that these cases often dragged on because the goal wasn't to win, but to pressure the other side into settling. Simone probably thought Mark couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle and would eventually agree to take less just to get some money quickly. But because this attorney took the case and was experienced in these specific issues, Mark had a real advantage. She told him she'd not only secure his full inheritance, but would make sure Simone paid his legal fees as well. I asked Mark how he wanted to handle things beyond the legal approach. He said he just wanted his money and then wanted nothing to do with Simone ever again. He said Claudia could stay in his life if she wanted, but Simone could go to hell. I took that as permission to do something I'd been planning. I wrote Simone a private message. I didn't send it through Facebook, but rather through email, which I got from Claudia. The message was direct. I introduced myself as Mark's oldest friend and made clear that if she wanted to continue pursuing this legal action, she'd have to go through not just him, but also me and our legal team. I laid out what her claim actually was in simple terms. She was claiming her disabled gay brother owed her money because he didn't help care for their parents while he was on dialysis and recovering from a transplant. I pointed out what this would look like to people in her life, particularly her children and the progressive community she was part of. I included a direct line about how her statement that James didn't count as family because he's Asian would sound at one of her speaking engagements versus at a right-wing political rally. I signed it with my name and added that Mark had someone watching out for him. I sent it on a Tuesday evening. I didn't tell Mark I'd sent it because I wanted him to have plausible deniability if things went sideways. I just waited to see what would happen. Update Simone responded to my email. It took her 3 days and her response was bizarre. She replied saying that what I'd sent was inappropriate and untrue. She told me never to contact her again and accused me of harassing her. She also added a line about how terrible it was that I'd sent such a message on an important day for her, though she didn't specify what day that was. I found out later she meant it was the day of some local election where a candidate she'd been supporting was on the ballot, as if that was remotely relevant. I didn't respond. There was no point. The message had done what I needed it to do, which was to put her on notice that this situation wasn't just going to stay quiet. But what happened next, I didn't anticipate. Simone forwarded my email to several people, not just Claudia, but also to her 3 children, and to a handful of her close friends from her activist work. She apparently sent it with some kind of explanation about how she was being attacked by Mark's unstable friend. She wanted these people to see how unreasonable and nasty I was being. It backfired completely. Her children knew immediately that something was very wrong. Simone's daughter, who I'd met a few times over the years at family events, called Claudia to ask what was going on. Claudia confirmed that everything in my email was true. The daughter then called Mark directly. She was horrified. She said she'd had no idea Simone was trying to take his inheritance, and she certainly didn't need or want money that came from cheating her uncle. Simone's 2 sons had similar reactions. The oldest one, the wealthy one, called Mark and apologized. He said he'd been sending his mother money whenever she asked because she'd told him she was struggling financially after helping care for their grandparent. He'd assumed she was being truthful. He never would have helped her if he'd known she was trying to steal from Mark. He told Mark that he'd personally make sure Simone dropped her legal claim. The youngest son, who Simone had mentioned was struggling after a layoff, sent Mark a long email. He explained that he'd been out of work for 3 months but had recently found a new position. He'd never asked his mother for money from any inheritance. She'd offered to help him with some bills, which he'd accepted, but he'd thought that was coming from her own saving. He said he'd rather be homeless than take money that rightfully belonged to Mark. This was all within the first week after Simone forwarded my email. But the real fallout came from her friends and colleagues. Several of them reached out to me directly. They found my contact information through Claudia, who gave it to them when they started asking questions. They wanted to know if what I'd written was accurate, I kept my responses simple. Yes, everything I said actually happened. Yes, Simone made comments about James being Asian and implying he'd take money back to the Philippines. Yes, Simone was trying to claim Mark's inheritance despite knowing he was disabled and had limited means. I didn't elaborate beyond confirming facts. I figured the facts were damning enough on their own. One of these people was someone I recognized from Simone's Facebook posts. She was involved in organizing an annual conference on environmental justice and had worked with Simone for years. She told me that several attendees of their planning meetings had now seen my email because Simone had shown it to them, presumably looking for sympathy. Instead, these people were questioning everything. How could someone who advocated so publicly for marginalized communities treat her own brother this way? How could someone who wrote articles about combating racism make racist statements about her brother's partner? The word spread quickly within Simone's circles. She tried to control the narrative by claiming that the whole situation was a misunderstanding. She told people that she and Mark had made an agreement years ago. If she took care of their parents, he would give her his share of the inheritance in return. She said she'd upheld her end by being the primary caregiver, but now Mark was refusing to honor the agreement. Someone, I don't know who, asked her the obvious follow-up question. If Mark was truly disabled and facing housing insecurity, why wouldn't she just let him have the money anyway? Even if there had been some agreement, which nobody believed, wouldn't basic decency and family loyalty mean giving a dying sibling the financial security he needed? Simone apparently didn't have a good answer to this. She tried to redirect by attacking me again, saying I was mentally unstable and had made everything up as part of some personal vendetta against her. But her own children had already confirmed the truth to multiple people by this point. Claudia had also spoken to several of Simone's colleagues and verified the facts. Simone's story kept changing, and people noticed. Within 2 weeks of my email being forwarded, Simone made a public statement on Facebook. She didn't go into details, but said there had been a family misunderstanding regarding their parents' estate and that it was now resolved. She said Mark would be receiving his full inheritance as specified in the will, and that she deeply regretted any confusion or pain the situation had caused. Mark called me the day that post went up. He'd seen it because several people had sent him screenshots. He said his lawyer had also received a message from Simone's attorney withdrawing the legal claim. It was over. At least the legal part. Mark was going to get his money, but the social consequences for Simone were still unfolding. She lost a speaking engagement at a conference on racial justice. The organization didn't make a public announcement, but quietly removed her from the program and replaced her with another speaker. She resigned from the board of a nonprofit she'd been involved with for over a decade. Again, no public announcement, but people in those circles knew why. Her reputation wasn't destroyed completely, but it was damaged in ways that mattered. The people whose opinions she valued, the communities she'd built her identity around, now saw her differently. Some of them had cut ties entirely. Others maintained surface-level civility, but with an obvious change in warmth. Simone's oldest son called me directly about 3 weeks after everything went public. He thanked me for standing up for Mark when the rest of the family had initially failed to do so. He said he'd grown up thinking his mother was someone who genuinely fought for equality, and learning the truth about how she treated Mark and James had shaken his understanding of who she really was. He wanted me to know that he and his siblings would make sure their mother never tried anything like this again. I appreciated the call, but I also knew that the situation had revealed something important. Simone's progressivism was performative. It was a public identity she maintained because it brought her status and respect in certain communities. But when actual principles conflicted with what she wanted, the principles disappeared immediately. She'd thrown away decades of relationships and credibility for money she didn't even need, simply because she couldn't handle being told no. Update: the legal process wrapped up last month. Mark received his full $150,000. Simone was also ordered to pay his legal fees, which came to about $8,000. She tried to contest that part, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. The ruling explicitly noted that her claim had no legal merit and appeared designed to pressure her brother into accepting a reduced settlement. Mark and James started looking at condos immediately. They found a place about 40 minutes outside the city, a ground floor unit with 2 bedrooms and an accessible bathroom. It's in an older building, nothing fancy, but it's clean and well maintained. The price was right at the top of their budget, but Mark's retirement savings combined with the inheritance made it possible. They closed on it 3 weeks ago. I helped them move. It took 2 days because Mark can't do any heavy lifting and James needed to pack carefully around Mark's medical equipment. The new place isn't large, but compared to their old apartment, it feels spacious. There's a small patio where James has already started growing herbs and vegetables. Mark set up his workspace in the 2nd bedroom so he can close the door when he needs quiet for work calls. Mark hasn't spoken to Simone since the legal claim was dropped. She sent him a text message a few weeks after her Facebook post, saying she hoped hoped they could eventually rebuild their relationship. Mark deleted it without responding. He told me later that there's nothing to rebuild. The person he thought she was never actually existed. Claudia visits Mark and James at their new place every few weeks. She drives down from Oregon, stays overnight in a nearby hotel, and spends the day with them. She's trying to maintain some kind of sibling relationship with Mark, and he's allowing it, though I can tell there's still distance. He doesn't trust her the way he used to. She was complicit in the initial approach, even if she backed out later, and that's hard to forget. As for Simone, I haven't heard much directly, but information filters through Claudia. Simone's daughter sends Claudia updates occasionally. Simone has mostly withdrawn from public activism. She still posts on social media, but far less frequently, and with fewer interactions. Several organizations she worked with have moved on without her. She still has friends, people who either didn't hear about what happened or chose to overlook it, but her social circle has shrunk significantly. One thing I never told Mark or anyone else in the family was something I discovered while going through old records from when I was younger. About 30 years ago, Mark and I were roommates in our 20s. Simone showed up at our door one day with her oldest son, who was 15 at the time. She'd gotten him accepted into a prestigious private school in our city on a scholarship. She told us that she needed him to stay with us for his last 2 years of high school because she couldn't afford to move to the city herself. Mark agreed immediately because he loved his nephew. I went along with it because Mark wanted it, and we had a second bedroom that wasn't being used. Simone left her son with us and went back to Oregon. She'd visit maybe once every 2 months, usually staying for a weekend before leaving again. I was working night shifts as a nurse at the time, pulling 12-hour shifts 3 or 4 nights a week. I was 24 years old, exhausted constantly, and suddenly helping raise a teenager. I paid for most of the household expenses because Mark was underemployed, and Simone sent maybe $300 a month, which didn't come close to covering food, utilities, and everything else a 15-year-old needs. I helped with homework, drove him to school activities, attended parent-teacher conferences because Simone couldn't be bothered to show up. Her son was a good kid. I actually enjoyed having him around, even though it was exhausting. He did well in school, got into a good college, and has turned out to be a decent adult. But Simone never acknowledged what Mark and I did. She never thanked us properly, never reimbursed us for the actual costs, never seemed to recognize that she'd dumped her parenting responsibilities on her younger brother and his roommate. Then, a year after her oldest son graduated and moved to college, Simone showed up again, this time with her daughter, who was also 15. Same situation. She'd gotten her daughter into the same private school, needed a place for her to stay, couldn't move to the city herself. Mark agreed again, and again I went along with it because saying no would have meant the girl lost her opportunity. Another 2 years of the same routine. I was older by then, 27, working day shifts, but still carrying most of the financial load. Simone's daughter was also wonderful. She went on to get a scholarship for college as well, and is now a successful professional. But again, Simone never properly acknowledged what we'd done or compensated us for the actual costs. I'd mostly forgotten about this, or at least packed it away in memory as just something that happened when we were young. But when Simone tried to make her legal claim about being an uncompensated caregiver, it all came back. She was claiming Mark owed her money for taking care of their parents he couldn't physically care for due to his medical condition. Meanwhile, she'd left her own children with Mark and me for 4 years total and never paid us adequately for it. I did some calculations. Using government estimates for the cost of raising a teenager, it comes to about $15,000 per year when you include food, housing, clothing, school expenses, and activities. 4 years total, 2 kids for 2 years each, comes to $60,000. Split between Mark and me, that's $30,000 each that we put toward raising Simone's children, while she used her child support money and government assistance to travel. I thought about telling Simone's children about this. They don't know the full story of those years. They remember living with us, but they were teenagers, and probably didn't realize how much their mother had dumped on us. If they knew the truth, that their mother had essentially abandoned them while collecting money meant for their care, they'd be devastated. But I decided not to say anything. Those 2 people turned out well despite their mother's choices, and I don't want them carrying the guilt of something that wasn't their fault. They were kids. Simone was the adult who made selfish decisions. I did write everything down though. I put together a detailed account of those years with dates, expenses, and copies of the minimal payments Simone sent. I saved it all in a file that I've backed up in multiple places. I sent Simone one final email letting her know this document exists. I didn't threaten her explicitly. I just said that if she ever tries to interfere with Mark's life again, or if she ever makes another claim about being an uncompensated caregiver, I have information that might interest various people in her life. She hasn't responded. She hasn't contacted Mark either. I consider the matter closed unless she decides to reopen it, in which case I have something that will finish what's left of her reputation. Mark is doing as well as can be expected given his health situation. He's working less now, taking more time to rest. James has been able to cut his work hours even further because they're not spending every dollar on rent. They have the security they needed, And that's all either of them wanted from any of this. I still see them twice a week. Sometimes I bring dinner, sometimes we just sit on their patio and talk. The situation with Simone doesn't come up much anymore. Mark seems lighter without the stress of fighting for what was rightfully his. That's the only resolution that mattered.